Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program, Exploring Archives, the Archive and Exhibition Making. This program is co-organized by Art and Practice and the Getty Research Institute and is organized in association with the exhibition Blondell Cummings, Dance as Moving Pictures, which is on view at Art and Practice until February 2022. Tonight's program invites curators Alison Burstein, Kristin Juarez, Rebecca Peabody, and Glen Phillips to discuss their work working in archives and making exhibitions. This program will be moderated by Alison. Hello, Alison.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us.
Great to have you.
So I'll pass it off to you to lead the program, and then we'll share some images and things of everyone's work in just a second.
Great. Thank you so much, Joshua, for that great introduction and for all of your work convening this program. It's really a privilege to be here tonight in conversation with colleagues from Art and Practice and the Getty. I'm really looking forward to speaking and learning from you all tonight. So as Joshua said, we're coming together on the occasion of the exhibition Blondell Cummings, Dance as Moving Pictures, to think broadly about the relationship between archives and exhibition making. I am thrilled to be joining the three curators who organized this exhibition, which draws largely from archival collections, including that of the Kitchen in New York, where I work. As we are coming together to discuss our work with archives across our different institutions, we have the chance to explore something that I'm personally very interested in, which is how archives record the networks that link artists, institutions, and art workers, and the ways that those connections persist and evolve over time. I think the Cummings exhibition and the associated programming are really wonderful examples of how research and curatorial processes can animate and extend such networks. And it's something that I'm really keen to talk about with you all here today. So to start our conversation, we'll each share a bit about our work with archives, starting with a few previous examples of projects we've worked on, and then moving more into the Blondell Cummings exhibition and thinking about archival and curatorial practice more broadly. So to begin, I'd love to open it up to the three of you, and then I'll share a bit about my work at the end. So I will turn it over here to Glenn to begin. I'd love to hear if you could just share about a few of the previous projects you've worked on.
Sure, thank you, Alison. So my name's Glen Phillips, and I'm Senior Curator and Head of Exhibitions at the Getty Research Institute, and also Head of Modern and Contemporary Collections here. And so a lot of my curatorial work, on the one hand, is making exhibitions, but on the other hand is working to build our archival collections and other modern and contemporary collections at the GRI. Working together with several other curators in the modern and contemporary section here. I think that the Blondell Cummings exhibition, it is an archival exhibition, and the beginning of the research for that exhibition was in the Kitchen archive and other archives here, like the Archive of High Performance magazine. In terms of previous projects, the Cummings exhibition, it's a video exhibition and it's a dance exhibition. So I thought I'd say just a couple words about a previous video exhibition I did and then a previous dance exhibition I did, because both of them kind of informed our thinking at least a little bit in terms of this project. I think we might have a slide coming up any minute. So the first project I'll talk about, it's a show, it's from a while ago now. It's called California Video. We did this at the Getty Center in 2008, and another collection kind of sparked this exhibition. It's the collection of the Long Beach Museum of Art, which launched one of the first video programs in the country at a museum, and I believe had the first video production facility as part of a museum. So this exhibition, we wanted to do a survey looking at all of California and looking from the birth of video to the contemporary work and mix that all together. And there were, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of video in this show, more than anyone could ever watch. But here we're seeing an image just kind of walking in, mixing the old and the new. We have some pieces by Diana Thader, then leading you into these stations where you could sit down looking at early work. Maybe if we could have the next slide. Here, sort of now we're moving towards the end of the show where we're switching more to larger installation pieces, but also still having the same sort of stations where you can sit and watch individual pieces, and you can barely see if you look through that doorway in the back. That's a commissioned piece from Jennifer Steinkamp in her little Oculus there, but that room was a study room where you could sit at stations and watch the entire show that way. So we sort of installed the show twice, once on kiosks where you could just browse a menu and just sit. Instead of having to walk through the show, you could just sit and watch everything, and people did. And then, or you could do it sort of spatially. We might have one more slide of this show. Here's another view sort of walking in. So this was this, in the corner there, this amazing piece by the groups Ant Farm and T.R. Uthko called The Eternal Frame, as they had sort of shown it originally at the Long Beach Museum. We had to reconstruct this piece, but the piece itself was a reconstruction of the JFK assassination that the artists kind of made in Dealey Plaza, and then installed this sort of living room for you to watch it in. So there was a lot of reconstruction work there. Moving on to Yvonne Rainer. This was a retrospective. It was based on Rainer's archive, which we have here at the Getty. And dances and films, because Rainer, she spent the first third of her career as a dancer. She spent the middle third of her career as a filmmaker. And then in 2000, she went back to dance again. So we were sort of looking at those two areas. And really pulling a lot from the objects in the archive. So showing a lot of scores, photographs, posters. We can see some of those on the next slide. The amazing kind of ephemera that proliferates around these sorts of projects, especially in the 60s and 70s. So we were looking at just a handful of her major pieces and showing how they were documented in different ways. On the one hand, it might be the scores and notes that Rainer would take on a piece, or what she might write in her diary. On the other hand, it might be the photographs that would capture, sometimes in these canonical stills. And then we had screenings where you could actually see the dance, or some of them. The early dances weren't always documented on film or video that much. And so a lot of the video work was looking at later pieces. I think we have just one last image here that's showing the, oh no, we don't. So I'm done. I think we're moving on. Is it moving on to Kristen next?
Yes, thank you, Glenn. I'm Kristin Juarez. I am the research specialist for the African American Art History Initiative at the Getty Research Institute. I wanted to pick up the last thread that Glenn mentioned, which is the Yvonne Rainer archive. And this is somewhere where we also found Blondell Cummings. We found her in Christina Talking Pictures. And of course, the film is a kind of record of her practice and her participation in the film. We also have scripts and notes that she wrote, and these are all within Yvonne Rainer's archive. So I just wanted to pull that into the conversation as I move into an introduction of my work. Prior to this, I was in New York and I worked at Dance Space Project, and I was brought on to help organize the exhibition that unfolds over time, which is called a platform, curated by Reggie Wilson. It was called Dancing Platform Praying Grounds, Blackness, Churches, and Downtown Dance. And it is also informed by kind of questions of the archive, questions of reconstruction and reconstructing speculative histories, and how architecture serves as a kind of living, breathing, concrete legacy of over time with different points of history that run through it, and also to work on the exhibition catalog. So Joshua, if you could pull up the first slide, please. So Dance Space Project is held and hosted by St. Mark's Church in the Bowery in the East Village, which is one of the oldest, it's like the second oldest and the oldest continuously running church in New York City. So it has this legacy very connected to Stuyvesant, founder, the Dutch founder of New York, to colonialism and slavery, to this turning point of what Manhattan would become. And it still stands after fires and everything. And so one of Reggie Wilson's questions was trying to understand how this place, which is a kind of beacon of Dutch colonialism, could also have these points of reference for the civil rights movement, for the Black Power movement, as well as be a host to experimental dance. And so a lot of our work, my work, was doing archival work and understanding how St. Mark's Church existed, how it was pictured, how it was understood by New Yorkers, and its role in downtown dance now. Next slide, please. Reggie Wilson is a choreographer, and he's really interested in how the body stores knowledge. And he's looking at gesture, he's looking at religious practices and movement. He's looking at histories of dance and appropriation. And so he is a kind of deeply driven by research. And these are two images from his personal collection that he likes to juxtapose. How are these two gestures performed by Ruth St. Denis and by a religious service in New York in the 1800s? How can these two gestures that look very similar be put in relationship? They have very different contexts, different origins, and still they are visually the same. They are the embodied kind of same gesture. And so he was really interested in juxtaposing this. And this is an example of a spread from the catalog designed by Raja Feather Kelly. Next slide, please. You can see that same gesture appear here. One of the kinds of research that we did, which is kind of exploring the gaps in the archival record, particularly around the architecture of St. Mark's Church. This is a balcony that runs along the nave of the church. And we've seen renderings of this balcony and know that alongside of its oldest companion church, St. Augustine, that this may have been called a slave gallery, which is where people of color, free and enslaved people would have been delegated to watch and participate in the service. And so there was research in terms of how can we find out if this is what, in fact, this architectural form, actually, that this was the purpose it served. And so part of what we had to do is talk to people, talk to the oldest members of the church, talk to the historians who are also members of the church. And through that, we found all of these kind of touch points of the church's history, as I mentioned, in the Black Power movement, in how this church became a kind of motivator in downtown for social justice from the 60s on, and how it became a place that served and hosted experimental dance and experimental poetry. So what we found was that there was no answer. We couldn't definitively say this is what purpose it served, and still the architecture kind of mimicked the church where we know this was its purpose. So this was a commissioned piece that Reggie was commissioned to do for this platform, and it was called "They Stood Shaking While Others Began to Dance." Excuse me, it was called "They Stood Shaking While Others Began to Shout." And that distinction is important because he was looking at the movement practices of Shakers, the religious practice of the Shakers, as well as the ring shout and the religious practice around ring shouts of Black diaspora. And he put these kinds of movement vocabularies into context. And as we see that gesture come back into the present, they're cited at the top of this speculatively identifiable architectural form of the slave gallery and this kind of apex of the dance that brought the platform, this month-long platform, to an end. It was a kind of empowering moment, I think, for everyone who participated in the research and the dance and viewing this exhibition. Next slide. And finally, you know, one thing that what I learned through this project was the ways in which dance is not just a relationship between a viewer and a dancer, but what are ways in which embodied practices can build community? What are ways in which embodied practices can remember histories? And so this is just a slide from a symposium that Reggie organized. And this is what was called a ceremonial offering by the artist Emily Johnson. And she led us in a kind of a dance where we started off kind of in a jumbled mass and ended up in this kind of in concentric circles holding hands. And there was also community building practice around it. And so we learned all of the places that we were bringing into the room through our presence. So just kind of tying that back into one of the things that I was thinking about with Wandell Cummings was, how do we bring her voice into the room, and how do we bring the voice of others and those who loved her and those who worked with her into how we design this exhibition? I'll turn it over now to Rebecca.
Thank you, Kristen. This is so interesting, seeing how our work together on the Blondell Cummings show relates in so many rich and fascinating ways to the projects we've all been working on. Glenn, it was a pleasure to see images from California Video. That show took place just a year after I started at the GRI, and I had the opportunity to work with you in a limited capacity on some of the material in the book. And it's just so interesting to me to think through, as you were talking about that, how my first moments at the GRI were this immersive experience in video and archives and exhibitions. And now we're working together on this show. Feels kind of like a full circle moment. Well, my role at the GRI is as head of a department called Research Projects and Academic Outreach. Joshua, I'm ready for my first slide. Thank you. In my capacity working with the research projects, I oversee the GRI's institutional research agenda, which is made up of between 12 and 15 multi-year collaborative team-based research projects, most of which are inspired by and aimed towards activating archival collections. So in that capacity, I have the opportunity to work in a larger sense with over a dozen different projects that are engaging with archives and putting them in conversation with other archives in really unique and innovative ways. And not all of them culminate in exhibitions, but many of them do. And the ones that don't culminate in other kinds of tangible outcomes to the conversation, such as book projects or public programs or new digital projects and tools. So it's a fascinating opportunity to really see multiple different ways of accessing archives and activating them all at the same time. Next slide, please. In my own work, I have tended to be more involved in books than in exhibitions, and I brought a couple of images to share with you here. A book that I just completed recently, co-editing with my colleagues Dominic Thomas and Stephen Nelson, called Visualizing Empire, Africa, Europe, and the Politics of Representation, dove deeply into one of our archival collections at the GRI, which is a repository of visual cultural images documenting the presence of French colonialism in North Africa. So we collected an amazing group of scholars working in multiple disciplines, all of whom dug into those materials and put them in conversation with other kinds of collections around the world to really see what they could show us about history in a new way through visual culture. And then another book project that I don't have an image of, Lawrence Alloway, Critic and Curator, which I co-edited with my colleagues, Courtney Martin and Lucy Brodnock, also dove deeply into one of our archival repositories, looking at the important and influential work of Lawrence Alloway through his papers, and another collection of amazing scholars coming together to approach that from multiple interdisciplinary perspectives. And then my last image is of one of my own projects. I'm an active scholar within and beyond the GRI, and Consuming Stories, Kara Walker and the Imagining of American Race is one of my individual projects. And this is also a deeply archival project in a different sense, though. Instead of mining the archives to learn more about Walker, I was focusing intensely on the work of an artist who herself goes into the archives for her source material. And she looks at archives that range from traditional historical paper archives to the ever-evolving terrain of social media and the internet, and the kinds of archives that we're constantly creating in that space as well. So that was another really interesting opportunity for me to think about archives in a different way. Alison, you mentioned networks in your introduction, and I'm really taken by that, because I'm seeing in all of our projects the importance of networks and how that as a metaphor is really important to what we're thinking about today.
That's great. Thank you all for sharing that and for picking up on that, Rebecca. I think it's something that I think really comes through in the institutions that we're all representing, both where we currently work and where we've worked before. The networks across the Getty dance space, the kitchen, chart onto works of artists like Blundell Cummings, as well as many others, which I'm excited to talk about. So just to share a bit about my own background and my work at the kitchen in New York. As I mentioned, I am a member of the curatorial team there. I'm the curator of media and engagement. And I just say a few words about the kitchen for those who aren't familiar. If we could get the first slide, Joshua. It's an organization that was founded in 1971 by a pair of artists, Steina and Woody Vasulka, dedicated to what was then the nascent form of video art, founded in a Soho art space, the Mercer Art Center in the disused kitchen, and then later moved in 1973 to the loft space we see on the left of this slide here. At that time, the organization became incorporated as a nonprofit and began to expand its programming beyond video art, music, performance, the forms that were initially supported in the Mercer Art space. And then in the new space on Wooster Street, they began to do programming across a wide range of disciplines, including visual art, dance, performance, music, and then later adding literature and other interdisciplinary forums. In 1986, the kitchen moved to the space in Chelsea that you see on the right, and that's where we are based today, and we continue to focus on programming across the full spectrum of art forms with a focus on experimentation and risk-taking that has been central to the kitchen's mission from the outset, really supporting forms of expression that aren't that don't fit neatly into other institutional forums such as galleries or larger institutions like museums. And with respect to the topic of the archives, the kitchen was very lucky in that with its focus on video art, it was able to document from the earliest days many of the performances that took place. And the archive shows this investment not only through these performance recordings, but also through things like installation images, exhibitions, as well as performances and printed matter and ephemera. And our 20th century archive is in the collection of the Getty Research Institute. And we are lucky to be able to collaborate with colleagues there around those materials. And our 21st century materials we maintain in-house. So I just wanted to note a few of the initiatives that we've launched over the past year to mark our institutional milestone of the 50th anniversary in 2021. And taking this occasion as an opportunity to both revisit our history and think about how we reanimate and carry forward aspects of the institution's legacy, we've developed programs that invite artists to engage with the archive as both material and a source of inspiration. One of these programs that we've established is the research residency, which we launched last spring with a cohort of 4 artists, Sharmi Basu, Will Lee, Nia Nottage, and Tyler Morris of Steph Christ Collective, and Tuesday Smiley. And these residents have spent 6 months following lines of inquiry that they outlined in their initial research proposals. And along the way, they've consulted a wide range of materials. If we could see the next slide. These include things like on the left, a poster that was designed by the collective Grand Fury for the kitchen as a programming calendar. And on the right, you see a job description, an internal administrative document. The residents have been consulting things such as these, as well as video recordings, exhibition images, oral histories, really the full gamut of our materials. And throughout the process, they've been in conversation both with one another and with members of our our curatorial team at the kitchen, as well as with colleagues from other institutions, including Glenn and Sarah Cooper from the Getty Museum, receiving feedback on their process and on their research along the way. That cohort of artists is now developing projects that will be publicly presented in the next year. So stay tuned for that. And another initiative that I want to mention is our video viewing room series, which is an online series on our site, The Kitchen On Screen, that presents recent and archival works with contextualizing text and media. And if we could see the next slide, one recent iteration of this series features a work by artist Jen Liu. You see this still on the right from her new film Electropore, which was made through a deep engagement with a work that is represented in the kitchen's archive. What you see on the left is a still from the sci-fi opera Warrior Sisters by composer and musician Fred Ho and librettist Antine Green. So this video viewing room showcases videos, both excerpts of the Warrior Sisters recording alongside Jen's new video, as well as a selection of archival documents that relate to the development and presentation of Warrior Sisters at the kitchen in 2000. And in working with Jen, working with these archival materials became a very important way to underscore the shared labor that went into the opera's production and the ways that this labor mirrors an investment in future building and coalition that is present in both Warrior Sisters and in Jen's own work. So I will leave it there, and I think we have many threads that will come through in our conversation, building on the ways that we've all worked, both with the archive as material, bringing in artists to respond to the archive, and also drawing from the archive as material for exhibitions. So as the starting point, we can focus on the exhibition at hand, Blondell Cummings Dances Moving Pictures, as it's currently installed in Art and Practice's space. And I was wondering, as the group of curators who have worked on this exhibition, if you could just share a bit about the origins of this exhibition, and then elaborate on the processes of archival research and exploration that gave form to what is now on view.
Who wants to take this one?
I can start with some of the bigger picture origins. I'll mention that the Getty and GRI launched the African American Art History Initiative a few years back. And from the beginning, we wanted very much to partner with a few different institutions in Los Angeles on research projects, exhibition projects of mutual interest that supported our shared goals. And Art and Practice was one of the institutions that we had always wanted to partner with. So when this opportunity came up, it was really a perfect answer to that goal that we'd had in mind. Glenn, do you want to say a little bit more about how we arrived at the content of the exhibition?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think we started just by knowing that we wanted to do a show and that it might be a video show and that we probably had material in the archive and we were going to go find it. And that the kitchen would be one of the big places that we would start, and maybe some other collections as well. And so, we started by just sort of doing a survey of artists in the kitchen, and particularly, wanting to focus on African American women artists, and that in itself was then a digitization project, because some of those recordings had been digitized, but a lot of them had not. And they need to be digitized because these are all older recordings still on tape. And in many cases, the recordings in the kitchen archive are unique. The kitchen, heroically managed to document almost every performance that they ever did, but that doesn't always mean that anything else happened to the tape aside from going into the archive. That's part of what's exciting, that in some cases, when we digitize these tapes, it means we're the first people to see this performance since it happened. And so that was sort of amazing. And we digitized, I forget the number, between the kitchen and another couple archives, it was maybe 70 to 80 tapes. And we just started watching them. And immediately, you know, Blondell Cummings was in the show. We didn't know what the show was, but we knew Blondell Cummings was in the show because we found these amazing recordings. And you know, we were thinking about a group show because there were other amazing recordings as well. But you know, as I always describe it, as the show kept going on, the group kept getting smaller. And it was 3 artists. Finally, we had it was 2 artists. And then there was just this moment where it was just so clear, okay, we're doing the Blondell Cummings retrospective. And I would also say there, I think there's this kind of magical thing because in the kitchen archive, almost all of the time, at least more than most of the time, the recordings in that archive are just the recordings that happened at the kitchen. But in the case of Blondell Cummings, there were her performances at the kitchen, but all of these other performances at other spaces as well. It was like a miniature archive of her work. And the recordings were not in great condition, or at least the ones from other institutions. And I think Kristen was the one digging in the archive who discovered this interesting thing that the kitchen was actually managing Blondell Cummings' touring schedule for a while. And so these tapes were the screeners that would get sent out to different institutions to see examples of her work if they were trying to decide. And you know, those screeners that had been played to death, they were saved and they sat there in the archive. And then the time came and we found it, and it gave us enough of an overview that we were able to know, okay, this is where we want to go. And then we could contact her family to find the better recordings. And I often refer to things like that as a time bomb that's sitting in the archive, because it maybe happened in a happenstance way, but then its time comes. And it was sort of a gift to us because all of a sudden, okay, we've got a show and we know what we need to do next. Kristen, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Sure. So what we needed to do next was to speak with her estate, with her family. And so we were put in touch with her family, first with Judy Hussey Taylor at Dance Space Project, put us in touch with Jalalewa Jozolar, who was good friends with Blondell, who said, you know, Elizabeth Streb is really, she has been stewarding her archive and you should reach out to her. And Elizabeth put us directly in touch with her family. And as we went to visit them in Brooklyn, we came into the basement and we saw that she actually, Blondell had hundreds of tapes. It wasn't just the recordings that we saw in the kitchen archives, but actually she was documenting and archiving all of her work. So we found what we hoped to find and more, in that we found some of the earliest works that we had known about dating back to 1978, and we found work that predated that. In addition, we also, by happenstance, found a number of works that she was making specifically for the camera. So she was not only recording her dances and performances, but she was also making work to be screened as video art. So we went in with a kind of rough repertory that we got from the kitchen archives that was in her notes as she was traveling. And then we were able to fill in the gaps of her practice in her personal archive. And we didn't know exactly what we were getting because it's labeled. They're all kinds of formats of video, from U-matics to EIAJs to VHS, some 16mm film, labeled, hand labeled mostly, sometimes printed out. And from that, we selected a handful with New York Public Library's blessings. That's where her archive now lives. And we had those digitized. And we spent a summer of reviewing every single hour, minute of tape that we had digitized. And it was, I don't know now, if I were to quantify it, maybe 100 hours or so, maybe more, maybe less, but it was a feat. And it was a kind of, it was a moment of great kind of discovery on our end to learn about how rigorous Blondell Cummings was in her practice and in her documentation.
And it's another way that we were so lucky at so many different times in this project, but we made those selections to be digitized shortly before the pandemic. We didn't really know, obviously, that was coming. And I think we had thought that what we selected that day would be the biggest batch. But then I also think we thought then once we'd gone through that, we could go back and choose to fill in, and we could make a sort of better next selection. And then that was suddenly off the table. And so how lucky were we that we happened to select things from every moment of her career so that we could really cover her whole chronology. And then the other amazing thing, we chose some of the better known pieces, kind of hoping that it would be a better copy than what was available. And that's something you really could have saved till the end, right? But we did it the first time. And then some things we chose just so randomly because the writing on the label was just evocative and cryptic. And then those actually, I think, two of the best pieces in the show wound up being because of that. And then there we had it. Just from that first selection, we had a whole show. Also, how exciting is it is that there's the whole rest of the archive that we didn't digitize, which means there are more shows that someone else can do that are going to have a lot more discoveries.
I think the origins of the show and then the unfolding of the research and development stage are really interesting to think about now in retrospect, because we had a lot of delays due to the pandemic, and that slowed our process at times. It helped us redirect our attention at times, and it also opened up a lot of new opportunities for us that we wouldn't have had otherwise in terms of advanced outreach to faculty and adding a book to the project. So it's a show that's very much influenced by the time of its making as well.
Yes, absolutely. And as you mentioned the book, Rebecca, that makes me interested to hear more about both the catalog component and the research guide that accompany this exhibition, which seems to me that they are ways that you've brought forward, this vast amount of conversation, time that you've spent with different, friends, family, collaborators, brought in materials that you've discovered throughout the process of developing the exhibition, and in that way sort of complement the experience of engaging directly with the work that you have in the gallery. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you all think about the relationship between those three different components, and then also, maybe how you decided which aspects to bring through and which context of the project.
We're trying to have telepathy on who's gonna go first, and it's not working.
I wonder if it's a good time, I'm sorry, just to bring up the images so we could maybe use those also a little bit to guide conversation.
I personally am really excited about thinking about the research guide and the faculty outreach that we did, and the book in the context of the exhibition, because it's two distinctly different ways that we are hoping to reach out and make sure that Blondell Cummings, her legacy, and the research that we've done on her work is accessible in different ways to different audiences and users. The research guide and the faculty open house, and I hope Kristen will say a little bit more about the faculty open house as well, but it's a thoughtful and concerted attempt on our part to reach out to faculty who either are teaching in the area that intersects with Blondell Cummings' work or could be, and to make her material really accessible to them through developing modules that can be used in syllabi, through making our resources really transparent and accessible, and situating them within a context of literatures, primary and secondary literatures. So it's really our hope that this will make its way into the hands of teachers across the country or even the world And I know that we have aspirations to do that more broadly as well with other research projects and other exhibitions to make that a major source of our energy and our time.
I'll just sort of add to that, you know, what you do when you do a show or a research project is you devote so much of your time to figuring out the connections, figuring out, okay, what are all of the collections that are out there? How do they relate? And if you're working at a collecting institution, then it's also, okay, what are all of the collections we have here? And how does that relate? And you kind of have to do that groundwork to do the show. So why aren't we sharing that groundwork? Because, you know, it's hard work because you can't just go to a list and find it. So why don't we make that list so people can find it? And, you know, once you sort of say it, it's so obvious. And so I think, you know, moving forward, we're going to be doing that a lot more for our exhibitions at the Research Institute, because we're so proud of how our collections do. I mean, so much of the curator's job is sort of making it deeper and deeper and deeper and more connected. But then we expect people to just, you know, divine that as if from heaven, because we don't make it that discoverable. And so I think we, you know, just the process of doing it with this show has made it so clear that we can do it a lot more and make it a lot easier for people to see those connections.
And I think to add to that, you know, in addition to kind of transparency around curatorial process and research, I think there's an additional layer of canon building, canon formation, and finding gaps that can be filled. And I think what we found with her work and when she's making work and who she's working with is that oftentimes we found her kind of within somebody else's archive. So we found her kind of at the periphery. And instead, this work and all of our work, both the research guide and the book and this exhibition, I think, attempt to center her practice at this one of these origin moments in the 70s of multidisciplinary practice. And if she's at the center of it, you still see her collaboration with Meredith Monk, Yvonne Rayner, Ishmael Houston Jones, but then you also get this layer of threading of community work that she's doing, in addition to working with experimental poets and women of color who are working at the edges of disciplines as well. And so you get this really unique tapestry that forges around her practice that is fundamentally a shift in how we understood this moment. And so I think making all of that information available just allows for more research to happen, allows for other threads to be tugged on. We have one central focus, and this is kind of the groundwork. And there's so much more to be said about her work.
That's great to hear. And I think with respect to the archive as a material, pulling out a few of the things that you were all mentioning, I think the ways in which the behind the scenes labor lives in the archive, but is often not made public, you know, these kinds of administrative documents that a researcher might find, but is not often made part of the material. I think that mirrors, as you're talking about making your own process public in the making of this exhibition, along with the catalog and the research guide. And similarly, I think the work that you're doing to sort of fill in the dots or fill in the gaps between and around archives where Blondell's presence is marked, but not in a central way, is something that I'm really interested in. And I'd love to hear all of you talk about that way in which archives can both are repositories and springboards for further research and connection. And I'd love to hear you think about that both in relation to this exhibition and some of the previous projects that you were mentioning. I think there are connections to many of the projects that you referred to earlier.
Yeah, one thing I would just note, you know, the show that is at Art and Practice is primarily a video exhibition. Had it not been the pandemic, it may have been another type of exhibition. I think, there are really interesting archival materials. There's amazing photographs, and, kind of similar to the images we saw from the Yvonne Rainer exhibition. We could have put that sort of material into the show and it would have been very interesting, but there was so much uncertainty around, well, can we make a loan request, to ship from New York, and then really know that the show is going to open on time. And the video was so strong and we had it in hand. And so we knew that we 100%, could make that show. And I'm actually glad it turned out that way, because it really then allows people to see the work first, and they may not have seen the work first. And maybe it's better to see the work first and then start thinking about the archive. But we're really proud and happy that we are able to put a lot of archival material into the book that's coming out. We're reproducing material from the archives. We found the most extraordinary photographs, really exciting, great photographs, and produced a lot of new stills from the videos. And then also kind of adding to the archive, we commissioned not only scholarly essays, but also recollections from some of the most significant people who we also wanted to acknowledge have been responsible for keeping her legacy going and stewarding that until now, and also, recognizing and supporting her throughout her career.
Just to jump in on that, one of the things that we found, as I mentioned, was her repertory. So that became a kind of roadmap that we could fill in, and also became a roadmap for Thomas de France, who was commissioned to write the first extended biography of her practice. And so these are touch points that he is able to make meaning of and to put into context of her touring schedule, and how she was, going up and down the Eastern Seaboard within a matter of 6 months, and what that must have been like on her body, the toll it took, and while she was making original work, and how we then were also able to see how she was constantly revising and recycling work in a way that was deliberate and intentional. So we see a kind of unfolding and shifting of title names, of descriptions. We see her bio and how she described herself and how she described her organization, the Cycle Art Foundation, what she meant about collaboration, what was her definition of postmodernism. There are all of these ways in which we, in some ways, could take a step back and let her speak first. And of course, there are many gaps that, that we have to look to those who knew her, right, to fill in who she was, in addition to what she left behind. So those were the kinds of elements that we're toggling between, I think, between the archive and particularly within the book. But we do see it in the exhibition with the wall text, which foregrounds her voice as a way to put a frame around the work on view.
I've been struck throughout this process by just coming to a deeper awareness of the generative role of curatorial practice in contextualizing scholarship. I'm thinking about the pieces that we've shown, of course, but also the pieces that we digitized, working closely with the family in the New York Public Library. I'm thinking about the new scholarship that we commissioned for the book, the remembrances that came together for the book. And it has just really impressed me that the exhibition is itself a story, but all of the choices around it are also a story that impacts the scholarship on Blundell Cummings and has opens up some new opportunities that weren't there before. So that's been a really interesting experience for me.
maybe picking up on that, something I'm interested in is the way in which the experience of a gallery exhibition is, of course, public and collective. You're in the space with others experiencing works in real time, as compared to the work of scholarship or engaging with archives, which, while archives are typically public, the experience of being in an archive is typically very individual focused. So thinking about a project like this and an artist's work who was engaged with thinking through questions in community, holding space for conversations with peers and collaborators. I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit about how you think about those two different sides of the experience of Blondel's work, the sort of focused individual research and the communal experience of the work in real time.
I might say that I think this project and process as co-curators has been really collaborative. Everything that we pulled, maybe individually we discussed, we talked about, we cited, we contextualized. And so there is a solitary, it can be a solitary experience, but I think more and more there are new ways of working that don't favor that anymore, that actually say like the conversation is what generates the scholarship, is what generates the ideas. So there's a little bit of, I think in terms of our process, kind of modeling and responding to her own way of working. Like I think we were doing kind of similar practices of collaboration to see what can happen if we work together.
Something that occurs to me is the productive contrast between working on an exhibition collaboratively as we did and the work of scholarship that leads towards a book, since that's the area that I've been more immersed on so far. And that seems very solitary in comparison to working on an exhibition, even when I've worked collaboratively in other books. There's the idea of the single scholar in the archives at their computer working on their essay. And it's just struck me that in my work in books, I've thought a lot about voice, whose voice is being shared, whose voice is being heard, whose voice is being prioritized. And that, of course, was very important to us in the exhibition as well, but in a dramatically different way, where we were actually working with Blondel Cummings' voice in a three-dimensional space that people could hear from multiple directions at once. And we're thinking about like, how are these different expressions of her voice coming together, interweaving. How is somebody hearing them at different moments as they move throughout the gallery? What are they encountering first? Which audio is moving through the gallery and kind of threading through the other sources of audio, and what effect does that have? What does it mean to have audio where you can no longer distinguish the words, but the vocal presence is still there and is still inflecting what you see around you? That was a totally new experience for me, and yet connected in some ways to the work that I have done with the presence of voice in my more solitary written work.
I feel like the last several exhibitions that I've worked on, the process has been more like a seminar, and it's really about looking at things together and talking about them, and then going off and maybe doing research and coming back. And it's that process of conversation that eventually you talk your way into the show. Eventually you reach this point where we all now feel that we've arrived at a story and we know how to tell it, and then you can start laying that out in space, and you've just kind of incrementally and through consensus arrived there, and you feel really good about it. And it's a way that I like working. It's not as romantic, though, as just sort of, pointing at the wall and saying, do that. My genius demands it.
I'm thinking about that in relation to the work of commissioning, which you've all done and spoken about in relation to your various projects, how that conversation that you were just describing, Glenn, also leads to new work by artists developed in response to the projects that you've worked on and perhaps that have a one exhibition forum, and then their work either is integrated. I'm thinking in the case of the California Video Exhibition, or Kristen, the project you spoke about at Dance Space, where the commissioned work becomes the centerpiece of the platform series. So if you could just speak a bit about that experience and those conversations and collaborations that unfold and weave through these projects in different ways. And if you have any thoughts in relation to this current exhibition, I'm curious as well.
I could say a lot about, I've worked on a lot of commissions in my life, and have arrived at some pretty strong ideas about them, with the main one being, make sure a commission is what you really want. Because a lot of times when someone commissions something, what they actually want is this other piece the artist made, but they want it to be new and theirs. And artists don't work that way. When you commission something, what you're saying to the artist is, I want to support you in your next project, whatever that is. And you need to give them that freedom, because if you, sometimes people aren't wanting to commission, they're wanting to give an assignment. And that's, I think that the best commissions really just offer support and freedom. And when you find yourself in a situation that you can support whatever the artist does, even if it is absolutely different, then that's great. And, but you have to really, to a degree, take yourself out of it and just allow that to happen. Now, of course, sometimes, if we think about, commissions for a book, if we're commissioning someone to share their memories of someone, then that can be a sort of assignment that everyone can understand. But when it's commissioning a performance, it's rare that an artist gets a commission and they want to do the exact same thing they did last time, because that's not a good use of the commission. The commission offers freedom.
I'll just speak kind of specifically to my work with Reggie Wilson and Dance Space, kind of echoing what Glenn said. That really is their mission. I would say Dance Space's mission is to support artists in the next phase of their practice. And so for the platform series, it is an exhibition that unfolds over time, over a month. With different artists, different kinds of experiences, and it takes the shape of what the choreographer as curator wants to do. And so because Reggie is so research driven and so archivally focused, both embodied practice and physical archives as well, what we were there to do was to support and give the grounding, the framework, the contextualization as needed, but also to throw ideas off of him to see if that's what he wanted to do. So, for example, his work that he was commissioned to do a dance, but leading up to that, there were walking tours, there was a symposium, there were other ways of engaging the ideas at hand. We commissioned a scholar to create a kind of dossier that told the history of New York, before the 1800s. And so there were all of these kinds of material support that we could provide, but we weren't shaping it or dictating it. It was a way in which we could take elements of his practice and say and what if we did it this way? What if we extended a kind of embodied practice into a walking tour and talking to people who did that kind of work. So it is, as Glenn was saying, I think following the lead of who you're commissioning and building a trust over time. That exhibition, I came on in the kind of outcome phase of it, but it unfolded over a series of conversations that took place over years. So it's I think also time has to be kind of baked into that process as well.
I've done less with commissioning artworks than both Glenn and Kristen, but I'm hearing some parallels with the work I have done, inviting new scholarship for some of the book projects I've worked on, in particular with the books that have been deliberately interdisciplinary, because working with scholars who come from literature, political science, history, film and media studies, they all bring different disciplinary practices and histories and different kinds of questions and different ways of engaging with visual material. So there's an element, again, of providing that central focus, that fulcrum around which we all turn, but being really open to and appreciative of the fact that that's going to come from some really different directions from the fields in which I'm anchored and with which I'm most familiar.
Absolutely. And I think in one thing that comes through to me in all of your answers that I too have experienced in the process of commissioning, and particularly when offering an archive as a source material or as something to work with in the process of commissioning, is how the learnings that can unfold for all of us, that the work of following and taking the lead from an artist can perhaps lead to new insights that we wouldn't have drawn from the archives ourselves as members of the institution, for example. But I am receiving word that we are almost out of time. So I now want to just hear, maybe drawing from all that you've shared and some of the interests that you've already charted across your previous projects, I'd love to hear a little bit about what is next for each of you, and whether there are particular insights or particularly rich experiences that you had in this process that you hope to carry into your next endeavors.
Maybe we're going in the same order we went before, so I'll just start. I'm working on two more retrospectives. One of them on the performance artist Barbara T. Smith, and then the other one, which I'll say more about now, is the retrospective of the artist Frederick Eversley. And that show will be presented as part of at the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College, formerly the Pomona College Museum of Art. And Rebecca McGrew there and I are working on this together, and it'll be part of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time Art and Science project. And Art and Practice did a beautiful Fred Eversley show a few years ago, looking at his black, white, and gray works. We've been kind of studying that exhibition, but the new angle that we're taking for the art and science theme is really looking at, Fred was an aerospace engineer before he was ever an artist, and he is a scientist. And he makes these amazing spun resin discs that are all functional lenses, and that aspect of the work is often left out. And so we're working together with scientists, with two physicists, to really dig deeper into his work. And we just had an experience the other day, all looking at a couple dozen of his works together, and it was mind-blowing. The way a physicist looks at these works is so different, because they're judging them based on the quality of the reflections, and a different lens makes different types of reflections, and they all have names that I didn't know. Whereas, for art people, if the sculpture has a reflection in it, you're usually trying to ignore that, right? Or if you look at all the photographs of Fred's work, they always don't have the reflection in them. But in fact, they're such an important part. So we're sort of developing another curatorial standard that is based on both how beautiful they are, but also how well they function as a lens, and the different types of effects of light and of energy capture and of fluid dynamics and these other things that aren't usually curatorial principles. So we're really excited for that show. It'll be in the fall of 2024.
I'll go next. I am working on a film series, Dancers on Film. It developed concurrently with this exhibition of Blondell Cummings' work, and it explores the impact of experimental dance on experimental film. So it's a kind of extension in many ways of what we learned of Blondell's practice. And so thus far, I've been in conversation with Okwui Pakwasili, Devin Emery, and Madeline Hunt Ehrlich. And in the spring, this upcoming spring, I will also include an archival study day. So we'll have an archival study day component where we can really see different kinds of material and different impacts that Black dance has had on experimental practice.
Along with Glenn and Kristen, I think we're eagerly awaiting the book for Blondell Cummings, which last I heard would maybe be out in December. So that will be really exciting for us. And I think we're also hoping to travel the exhibition, which will mean an opportunity for it to move into different contexts and be seen by new viewerships, which is really exciting to think about. In my institutional work, I'm really inspired by the faculty outreach that we did with the Blondell Cummings show, and I'm looking forward to extending that into our other research projects and making that a bigger focus of our time and energy, really thinking about how to take all the research that we do and kind of echoing the solitary nature of scholarship that we were talking about, and really deliberately breaking that down and making it accessible to as broad a group of users as possible.
That's great to hear. And maybe one other question I'm curious about, just building on this experience of having collaborated both as a collective within the Getty and with Art in Practice for the first time in this project. I'd love to know if there's anything that you are taking away. We've spoken a bit about what the collaborative process for you all was like, but collaboration amongst institutions, how that might have shifted or informed the ways you're thinking about projects like this and the potential for future.
Well, I think we love collaborating, and at the GRI in general, we actually have done a lot of collaborative exhibitions over the years, often partnering with sort of alternative spaces, smaller spaces, where we can have the advantage of a different location, a different audience, different types of spaces, and hopefully the institution can get an advantage of the types of research resources that we have that can bring a different type of exhibition. We love doing that, and there've been some really productive partnerships that have been some of my favorite shows. So I think we're continuing, I think, to want to look for opportunities like that for sure.
Just to add on to something that Rebecca was mentioning around touring the show, I think something that we've been thinking about is how might the exhibition change based off of the context that it'll be in next? What are the ways that it would be more responsive to the environment that it will inhabit? So those are some of the things, and that I think is really responsive to, also to Blondell Cummings' work, that she was constantly revising, recycling her practice and her dances to be of the moment and for the environment she was working in.
It's been such a pleasure collaborating with Art in Practice. I don't want it to end, so I hope that we have another project in the works soon. But this also makes me think about the point you raised at the beginning, Alison, about networks and how the networks that we form as we move through our lives and through our practices not only define our work in some ways, but define who we are. And the opportunity to deliberately form those networks through partnerships and through collaborations is really, it's humbling and really gratifying as well.
Thank you all for that. It's such an inspiring conversation to listen to. Thank you, Alison, for guiding the conversation, and to the team at the GRI for the collaboration on the exhibition. We are also very excited and hopeful for future collaborations. And one thing I wanted to say is that the work that you are all doing is so important on so many different levels. And thank you for thinking so deeply about the way that people can engage with art. I think that this conversation is really going to illuminate a lot of things for people in terms of how some of the work is done, and more specifically, how the people that are doing the work, how it affects the decisions that they make, which I think is really exciting. So thank you.